There is something almost unbearably quiet about the way the body ends. Not violent, not sudden in most cases, not the dramatic collapse we see in films. It is more like a tide going out, gentle, orderly, methodical. A long, slow relinquishment of the things that took a lifetime to build. And if you sit with that long enough, if you really let yourself think about the biology of it, what the cells are doing, what the brain is experiencing, what the senses are holding on to last, you will find that dying is not the blunt and terrifying thing most people imagine. It is, in most cases, something far stranger and far quieter than that. Something that science is only now beginning to properly understand. So, get comfortable. Find whatever position makes the tension leave your shoulders. And let us follow this process from the very beginning, the weeks before the end, all the way through to the final moment itself, and just a little beyond. Because what happens inside the human body in that window of time is one of the most intricate, most surprisingly peaceful, and most scientifically fascinating stories in all of biology. This is not a frightening story. It is a deeply human one. Part 1. The quiet beginning, weeks before death. The body does not announce what is coming with anything as dramatic as an alarm. There is no siren, no single failing system that suddenly goes dark and signals to the rest of the machinery that the end has arrived. Instead, what happens in the weeks before death is much more subtle, much more gradual, and in a way that takes most people completely by surprise, because it feels at first almost indistinguishable from simply being tired. It begins with appetite, not in the way hunger normally disappears, not because of nausea or discomfort or emotional distress, but because the body, at a very deep and automatic level, simply stops asking for fuel. The digestive system begins to slow. The metabolic demand that drove a person to the kitchen every few hours, that signaled the stomach to tighten and growl, that made certain smells irresistible from 3 rooms away, that whole intricate feedback loop of hunger and satiety begins to wind down. The dying body is entering a deeply catabolic state, meaning it is breaking down faster than it can rebuild, and the signal to eat becomes quieter and then quieter still, until it barely registers at all. This is not starvation in any ordinary sense. The body is not depriving itself out of illness or failure in the usual understanding. It is, in its way, making a rational adjustment. When the systems that process food, absorb nutrients, and distribute energy across the body begin to falter, the energy required to run the digestive system itself becomes a kind of waste. The body begins redirecting what little fuel it has left toward the organs it still needs most. The heart, the lungs, the brain. Everything else begins to receive less attention, less blood, less energy. And the digestive system, that long, complex, energy-hungry highway of absorption and processing, falls quiet. For families watching a loved one near the end of life, this is often the first sign that something has shifted, and it is also one of the hardest to accept. The impulse to feed someone, to bring broth, to encourage one more sip of juice, is a deeply human one. It reads like care. It feels like refusing to accept what is happening. But what hospice nurses and palliative care physicians understand, and what families eventually have to learn, is that forcing food or fluid at this stage does not help. It can, in fact, cause real discomfort. The body is not withholding its appetite out of some failure of will. It is releasing it deliberately, or at least as deliberately as an unconscious biological process can release anything. The appetite goes because it needs to go. Sleep deepens in these weeks as well. The person begins to rest in longer and longer stretches, sometimes 15 or more hours in a single day. This is not the productive, restorative sleep of a healthy body that cycles through its stages, consolidates memories, repairs tissues, and wakes refreshed. This is something different. It is the sleep of a body, conserving its remaining resources with extraordinary efficiency. The heart is growing less able to pump oxygen-rich blood throughout the system. Without adequate oxygen delivery, the cells throughout the body, including the neurons in the brain, simply do not have the energy required to sustain wakefulness for long periods. The sleeping is not laziness or withdrawal. It is the body's version of dimming the lights to save power. And alongside the physical withdrawal, there is often a social one. The person begins turning inward. Conversations that would once have stretched for hours become shorter. The interest in news, in family gossip, in the small ongoing narrative of the household fades. There is a quality of detachment that can feel, to those on the outside, like a kind of sadness. Like the person has lost interest in the world, or perhaps in the people who love them. But what clinicians who have spent careers in palliative care will tell you is that this is not emotional withdrawal. It is physical. The body is pulling its resources back toward the core, and the cognitive effort required for sustained social engagement, for tracking conversation, for maintaining the quick back and forth of normal human interaction, becomes genuinely costly in a way it never was before. The skin begins to change as well. It becomes thinner, more translucent. The body is no longer regenerating skin cells at the rate it once did, because the biological priority list has been reshuffled and skin renewal does not make the top tier. The face can take on a kind of papery delicacy. The hands and feet may begin to feel slightly cooler than they once did, because the circulatory system is already, quietly and without any announcement, beginning to narrow its reach, concentrating blood flow toward the organs that the body has decided it cannot yet afford to let go of. There is also something that happens in these weeks that is harder to describe physically, because it sits closer to the boundary between biology and something else. Many dying people begin to talk differently about time, about the future. Some stop making plans, not because they are giving up, not because they have been told explicitly that death is near, but because something in the body's deepest regulatory systems seems to understand what is happening and begins, very quietly, to communicate that understanding upward. The urgency of next year, of the holiday in December, of the appointment 3 months away, dissolves, not with grief in many cases, sometimes almost with relief. This is the weeks out picture, a body conserving energy with extraordinary precision, an appetite becoming a whisper, a social self beginning the long, unhurried process of saying goodbye to everything it ever needed. The machinery is not breaking down chaotically. It is shutting down in a sequence, and the sequence, in most natural deaths, is surprisingly orderly. If you're watching this from somewhere, I'd love to know where. Drop your location and what time it is in the comments below. And if this kind of slow, detailed science content is the thing that helps you unwind, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a new video. Part 2. The body's retreat, days before death. When death is somewhere in the range of days rather than weeks, the changes that were subtle and slow begin to arrive with more clarity. The body's retreat from the periphery accelerates. The conversation between the brain and the body's extremities grows quieter and then quieter still, until the hands and feet and legs are receiving only the barest minimum of circulation, just enough to maintain some basic cellular function, but not enough to keep them warm. The hands begin to cool. Anyone who has sat at the bedside of a dying person will remember this. The particular coolness of fingers that were once warm, that once gripped back when you held them. The temperature drops in the extremities because the heart, now working less efficiently than it once did, is sending the blood it can still pump to the places where it matters most in this final accounting. The core, the vital organs, the brain. The hands and feet are, in the body's brutal hierarchy of needs at this stage, expendable. The skin changes color, along with the temperature drop. Mottling appears first on the knees and feet, a blotchy, purplish discoloration that forms as blood stagnates in the small vessels near the surface. The medical term is levato reticularis, and while it can appear in living people under certain conditions, in the dying it is something different. It is the map of a circulation that is narrowing, retreating, pulling back from the edges of the territory it once managed so effortlessly. The pattern is lacy, irregular, sometimes spreading up the legs or appearing on the back of the hands. It is one of the signs that hospice nurses are trained to recognize as a reliable indicator that death is not weeks away. It is days, and sometimes hours. Urine output slows and then stops. The kidneys, which under normal circumstances filter around 180 liters of blood every single day to produce the roughly 1 to 2 liters of urine that leaves the body, begin to shut down as blood pressure drops and blood flow to them diminishes. The body stops cleaning itself in the usual way. Waste products that would ordinarily be excreted begin to accumulate in the bloodstream, and this has its own effect on the brain, contributing to the confusion, the altered consciousness, the strange in-between quality of awareness that characterizes the days before death. Bowel activity stops as well, not because of any dramatic failure, but because the gut, like every other organ receiving less blood and less energy, simply ceases its peristaltic contractions, those rhythmic waves of muscle movement that push food and fluid through the intestines. Everything grows still in a place that is usually one of the body's most active and continuously working systems. There is a particular restlessness that can appear in these days that is entirely at odds with the general quieting. It has a clinical name, terminal restlessness or terminal agitation, and it is one of the more distressing things for families to witness because it looks, from the outside, like suffering. The person may pull at their sheets or their clothing. They may try to get out of bed. They may pick repeatedly at the air or at the blankets covering them, reaching for something invisible. They may call out, moan, repeat phrases that make no immediate sense. What is happening is not, in most cases, physical pain. The brain, now experiencing altered chemistry from the accumulation of metabolic waste, from fluctuating oxygen levels, from the complex neurochemical changes that accompany dying, is interpreting its internal state as restlessness. The movement, the picking, the reaching, these are neurological phenomena rather than expressions of fear or pain. The brain is processing something that it does not have the context to understand, and it is producing movement as a response. Palliative care specialists are skilled at distinguishing this kind of agitation from genuine pain and at treating it with medications that calm the neurological storm without adding to the person's suffering. But alongside the restlessness, there is something else, something that takes the people at the bedside much longer to understand and much longer to make peace with. Many dying people, in the days before death, begin to speak to people who are not in the room. They turn their head toward a corner of the ceiling. They reach towards something that no one else can see. They speak names, sometimes names of people who died years or decades ago. They seem not confused exactly, but occupied, attending to something happening in a space that the living people around them cannot perceive. The conventional medical explanation is that these are hallucinations produced by a brain working under extreme metabolic stress. The neurotransmitter ratios are disrupted. Oxygen delivery is impaired. The chemical landscape of the dying brain is nothing like the landscape of a healthy one, and in that altered chemical environment, perception can produce experiences that have no correspondence to the physical world around the person. This is a reasonable explanation, and there is real biology behind it. But here is what is interesting. The research on what clinicians call end-of-life visions or deathbed visions shows patterns that are strange from a purely hallucinatory framework. Multiple studies have found that between 50 and 90% of dying patients report these experiences. The figures that appear most commonly are not random. They are not strangers or demons or the monsters that fear might produce. The most commonly reported figures are deceased family members. Mothers appear most often, followed by spouses, siblings, children. The emotional quality of these experiences is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, comforting, not frightening, not distressing, peaceful, even joyful. Patients who experience them frequently report feeling welcomed, reassured, invited, rather than threatened. Japanese researchers conducted a nationwide survey of bereaved family members of cancer patients and found that the majority of families who witnessed these experiences, despite the confusion and strangeness of watching their loved one appear to speak to people who were not present, ultimately described the experience as meaningful rather than frightening. Something about it felt, to many of them, like a preparation, like a kind of help arriving for the journey ahead. What science can say with certainty is that these experiences are real to the people having them. They are not nothing, whether they represent a dying brain constructing comforting imagery from its store of memories, a genuine perceptual opening at the boundary of life, or something that current science simply does not have the language to describe. That remains one of the genuinely open questions that sits at the edge of what we understand about the human mind. Part 3. The chemistry of letting go. The body's internal pharmacy. Here is something that surprises almost everyone who encounters it for the first time. Dying, in the majority of natural deaths, is not painful in the way that living people fear it will be. The anxiety about death is, in most cases, far worse than the experience of dying itself. And part of the reason for this involves a pharmacological system that the body activates automatically as the end approaches, a flood of internal chemistry that makes the transition far gentler than the outside observer would ever guess from watching. The body is not passive in the face of its own ending. It is not simply a machine that stops when the fuel runs out. It is a system with extraordinary biochemical depth, and in the final days and hours, it deploys some of that depth in a way that looks, from the outside, almost like mercy. The endorphin system, the body's own network of natural opioid compounds, releases massively under conditions of extreme physiological stress. Endorphins bind to the same receptors that respond to morphine. They blunt pain. They generate feelings of calm, even euphoria. They soften the sharp edges of physical distress. Runners experience a mild version of this after a long race, when the post-exercise endorphin release produces that particular sensation of pleasant exhaustion and mild elation that athletes sometimes describe as a runner's high. What happens in the dying body is orders of magnitude beyond that, a release not measured in mild pleasantness but in genuine, deep analgesia and a sense of peace that many near-death experience survivors describe as the most profound calm they have ever felt. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with mood regulation, with the baseline sense of well-being that underlies ordinary daily contentment, also rises in the dying brain. A 2011 study conducted on rats found that serotonin levels in the brain tripled in the moments of dying. Whether the exact same mechanism operates in humans has not been definitively confirmed, but researchers at the University of Liverpool and elsewhere have considered the possibility seriously. Elevated serotonin can produce altered states of consciousness. It can generate visual and auditory experiences that are vivid and coherent but disconnected from ordinary sensory reality. It is the mechanism underlying psilocybin mushrooms and other serotonergic psychedelics. And in the dying brain, it may be part of what makes the transition to unconsciousness feel, for many people, not like falling into nothing, but like arriving somewhere. Then there is the question of DMT. N-dimethyltryptamine is a naturally occurring psychedelic compound that has been detected in human blood, urine, and cerebrospinal fluid. The enzymes required to synthesize it have been found in human brain tissue, strongly suggesting that the brain does produce it, though in what quantities and under what circumstances remains a subject of active research rather than settled fact. The hypothesis that the brain releases DMT in significant quantities at or near the moment of death has circulated since psychiatrist Rick Strassman's work in the 1990s and has captured enormous public interest. What is known is this: people who are administered DMT intravenously under clinical conditions consistently report experiences that bear striking similarities to near-death experiences. The sensation of leaving the body, the encounter with presences or entities, the life review, the tunnel and the light, a feeling described almost universally as more real than ordinary reality. A 2018 study, published in a peer-reviewed journal, found that when researchers compared DMT experiences with near-death experience accounts systematically, the phenomenological overlap was significant enough to take seriously. This does not prove that DMT causes near-death experiences, or even that it is released in the quantities the hypothesis requires. The truth is that measuring neurochemistry in a dying human brain in the moments of death is practically impossible with current technology. The hypothesis remains open and genuinely interesting rather than confirmed. What is confirmed is the broader picture. The brain does not go quietly. It does not simply lose power and go dark. It deploys neurochemical resources that shape the experience of the person going through it. Pain decreases. Anxiety often softens and then disappears entirely as consciousness fades. And in the hours before death, many people seem to cross over into a state that is less frightened and more peaceful than the state of ordinary waking life, not because they have accepted the metaphysics of dying, but because the biology of it is producing that peace as a kind of automatic response. There are also the stress hormones to consider. Cortisol and adrenaline are released in response to threat, to the perception of danger, to the body's fight-or-flight system activating. In a sudden traumatic death, these systems fire massively. But in the slow, natural death, the body's response is different. The cortisol rises, but it is working in a different context, one where the body is not fleeing or fighting, but winding down. And the combined effect of rising endorphins, rising serotonin, and the deeper chemical cocktail of the dying process seems, in most documented cases, to produce sedation and relief rather than terror. This is not a comforting fairy tale that hospice workers tell to ease family grief. It is grounded in what clinicians observe at the bedside, in what near-death experience survivors consistently report, and in the biology of a system that has, built into its deepest architecture, a mechanism for making its own ending more bearable. Part 4. The Brain at the Edge. Consciousness, Confusion, and the Last Territory. The brain, in the days and hours before death, is doing something that no organ except itself would be capable of. It is trying to make sense of an experience it has never had before, using tools that were shaped entirely by experiences of being alive. It is navigating the end of its own existence with the only equipment it has, the vast and intricate network of connections and chemistry and memory and prediction that it spent an entire lifetime building. And in that navigation, it produces things that are extraordinary. Consciousness does not simply stay intact until death and then vanish. It changes, it cycles. It moves between states that the dying person experiences, in many cases, as something closer to dreaming than to ordinary waking. In the days before death, most people begin to drift between consciousness and unconsciousness, sometimes within the same hour, sometimes within minutes. They may be briefly alert and responsive, making eye contact, squeezing a hand, answering a simple question, and then they are gone again, back into some interior place that no one at the bedside can follow them into. The brain is running on less oxygen than it evolved to require. Blood pressure is dropping. The blood that reaches the brain is carrying less oxygen than it should. And in the state of mild to moderate cerebral hypoxia that this produces, the brain does something that no one fully predicted it would do. It becomes, in some respects, more active in certain regions rather than less. Hypoxia, mild oxygen deprivation, produces altered consciousness in ways that researchers who have studied high-altitude climbing, deep-sea diving, and controlled laboratory conditions have documented extensively. It can produce feelings of euphoria. It can narrow peripheral vision in a way that creates the sensation of a tunnel. It can generate vivid internal imagery. It can cause time perception to distort dramatically so that seconds stretch into what feels like hours, and an entire lifetime of memories can feel as if it is playing back in a moment of real time. These are not random effects. They are the specific phenomenology of a brain receiving less oxygen than it needs, processing that deficit in the particular way that the human neural architecture tends to process it. In the weeks and days before death, the brain is also dealing with the accumulation of toxins that the kidneys and liver can no longer efficiently clear. Urea, from protein breakdown, accumulates in the blood. Ammonia levels rise. Inflammatory markers that would normally be managed by organs still functioning at capacity begin to affect brain chemistry directly. The result is a condition that clinicians call uremic encephalopathy, a kind of metabolic fog that settles over consciousness and alters cognition in ways that look, from the outside, like confusion or delirium, but are, from the inside, something more complex. Many dying people in this state report, if they can still communicate at all, that they are somewhere between two places. Not asleep exactly, but not awake in the usual sense. They may speak of being on a journey. They may describe landscapes they are moving through. They may seem to be having conversations that are entirely internal, but that they are narrating fragments of aloud, the way people sometimes narrate dreams without realizing it. The brain is not hallucinating randomly. It is doing what the human brain always does when it encounters an experience without adequate context. It reaches for the closest thing it knows, the deepest structures of narrative and memory and story, and it builds something from them. What is remarkable, and what several researchers in palliative care have noted with genuine awe, is how little fear tends to accompany this state. In the large majority of documented cases, the altered consciousness of the dying person in these final days is not characterized by terror or agony. It is characterized by a quality of peace that families sometimes describe as beautiful and sometimes describe as heartbreaking, because it makes the loss feel quieter than it should. The person does not seem to be fighting anymore. They seem to have moved somewhere beyond fighting. This is partly the neurochemistry, the endorphins, the rising serotonin, the hypoxia-induced alterations in pain processing and emotional regulation. But it is also, researchers suspect, partly something about the brain's fundamental response to the approach of its own dissolution. There is a line of thinking in neuroscience, still speculative but grounded in what is known about how the brain generates its sense of self, that the fear of death is, in some sense, a fear of a future the brain can still imagine inhabiting. When the brain's ability to project itself into the future begins to fail, when the neural architecture that generates the feeling of I, the sense of a continuous self moving through time, begins to dissolve, the fear that accompanied the anticipation of that dissolution also dissolves. Not because the person has made peace with dying, in any philosophical sense, because the brain that was afraid is no longer structured in a way that can sustain fear. Part 5. Terminal lucidity, the last surprising gift. Among the most astonishing and least explained phenomena in the science of dying is one that clinicians have documented for well over 2 centuries, that researchers have only recently begun to study in a systematic way, and that families who witness it almost universally describe as one of the most profound experiences of their lives. It is called terminal lucidity, and it is exactly as strange as it sounds. Terminal lucidity is the unexpected return of mental clarity and cognitive function in people who have been severely impaired, sometimes for years. In its most striking forms, it occurs in people with late-stage dementia, with severe brain damage, with conditions that have eroded memory and personality, and the capacity for coherent communication to the point where families had believed, with full medical support for that belief, that the person they loved was gone. And then, in the days before death, sometimes hours before, that person comes back. Not just partially, not just the brief opening of eyes, or the squeeze of a hand that families learn to read as communication from someone who can no longer speak. They come back. They speak clearly. They recognize faces they had not recognized in months or years. They call people by name. They have conversations. They express gratitude or love, or say things that the people in the room will spend the rest of their lives carrying. The term was formally coined in 2009 by researchers Michael Nahm and Bruce Grayson, who defined it as the unexpected return of mental clarity and memory shortly before death in patients suffering from severe psychiatric and neurological disorders. But accounts of the phenomenon appear in medical literature going back to the 19th century, when physicians observed it and noted it in their clinical records with a mixture of wonder and confusion that has not entirely left the field since. In a 2009 study of 100 consecutive deaths in New Zealand, approximately 6% of patients experienced a lucid episode. British hospice studies have found that roughly 7 in 10 caregivers report having witnessed it at least once in their professional careers. In the United States, a survey of healthcare professionals suggested that 73% had observed it at some point. Those numbers tell a consistent story. This is not a rare fringe phenomenon. It is something that people who work with the dying see regularly. What makes terminal lucidity particularly difficult to explain from within conventional neuroscience is that it occurs in people whose brains should not be capable of producing it. A person with severe Alzheimer's disease has a brain that has undergone massive structural damage. The neurons that supported memory, language, personality, and recognition are simply not there anymore in the quantities that would be needed to generate the kind of clear, coherent, emotionally connected communication that terminal lucidity produces. And yet it happens. A woman who has not recognized her daughter for 3 years looks at her and says her name. A man who has been nonverbal for months tells his son that he loves him. These are not fabrications. They are documented clinical observations from trained professionals who have no stake in making them more mysterious than they are. The hypotheses that researchers have put forward are genuinely interesting. One suggests that the dying process itself produces a surge of neurochemical or electrical activity that temporarily reactivates dormant circuits, like a last surge of electrical current through a failing system that briefly powers things that had gone dark. This connects to what researchers have found about the dying brain more broadly, that it does not simply lose power uniformly, that it can produce activity in specific regions at specific moments that exceeds anything that would be predicted from its baseline state. Another hypothesis involves the inhibitory systems of the brain. In healthy cognition, large networks of neurons are continuously held in check by inhibitory signals, a constant background of restraint that keeps the brain from firing in uncontrolled cascades. As the brain's chemistry shifts in the dying process, those inhibitory systems may fail first, releasing circuits that were suppressed rather than destroyed, allowing memory and personality and recognition that were locked away behind a wall of inhibition to briefly surface. What terminal lucidity means for how we understand brain and consciousness is a question that remains genuinely open. It challenges any simple model in which the mind is entirely and completely reducible to the current structural state of the brain. A brain that should not be able to produce coherent speech, specific memory, and emotional recognition does produce those things. And then, shortly after, the person dies. The lucidity ends. Whatever opened briefly closes. For families, these moments are almost always experienced as a gift. The person they had been grieving while still alive comes back one more time. There is a final conversation, or a final moment of recognition that the person carries forward. The grief is not diminished by it, but the loss is different when it is preceded by that moment of return. There is a completion that would not have been there otherwise. Part 6. The final hours. Breathing, circulation, and the long countdown. There is a point in the dying process where the timeline shifts from days to hours, and the body's communication of that shift is almost always through the breath. Breathing changes first, and it changes in a way that, once you know what it means, you do not forget. The pattern has a name. It was described by two physicians in the early 19th century, John Shane and William Stokes, who observed it independently and documented it in their clinical records. It is called Shane-Stokes respiration, and it has been recognized as a sign of imminent death for over 200 years. What the pattern looks like, if you watch it, is this. The breathing becomes irregular. There is a cycle. The person takes a few shallow breaths, then the breaths deepen and quicken, building to a peak, and then they slow and grow shallow again, and then they stop entirely. The pause can last for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, sometimes longer, and then the cycle begins again. For anyone sitting at the bedside who does not know what they are watching, those pauses can feel catastrophic. Every one of them feels like the last breath. And then breathing resumes. And then it stops again. What is happening physiologically is that the brain's respiratory control center, the region in the brainstem called the medulla oblongata, is losing its ability to regulate the balance of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the blood with its usual precision. Under normal circumstances, this control is automatic and exquisitely sensitive. A tiny rise in carbon dioxide in the blood triggers an immediate increase in breathing rate. A drop in carbon dioxide causes breathing to slow. The feedback loop runs continuously, thousands of times a day, without any conscious involvement at all. In the dying brain, this feedback loop begins to fail. The medulla can no longer respond to carbon dioxide signals quickly enough or accurately enough to maintain smooth, continuous breathing. Carbon dioxide rises during a pause, eventually triggering a burst of breathing that drives the concentration down too far. Breathing slows and stops again. The cycle repeats. The brain's respiratory thermostat has lost its calibration. Alongside the Shane-Stokes pattern, there is often a sound that families find among the most difficult to hear. It is called the death rattle, which is a vivid and somewhat brutal piece of clinical language, but it describes something that has a relatively simple, mechanical explanation. In healthy people, swallowing reflexes and the ability to cough clear secretions, the normal mucus and fluid that the airways produce, from the throat. In the final hours of dying, those reflexes weaken and then disappear entirely. The person is often lying flat or semi-reclined, which allows fluid to accumulate in the upper airway. And as air moves in and out past that pooled fluid, it produces the characteristic wet, rattling sound that carries across a room. It is worth knowing, because it matters enormously to the families who hear it, that this sound is almost certainly not distressing to the person producing it. By the time the death rattle begins, most people are deeply unconscious, far beyond the ability to experience the sound or the accumulation of fluid as uncomfortable. The rattle is distressing to the people in the room. The person dying is, in most documented cases, entirely unaware of it. Blood pressure in these final hours is collapsing. Systolic blood pressure, which in a healthy adult at rest runs around 120 millimeters of mercury, drops below 80, then below 60. The oxygen saturation of the blood falls below 90%, then lower. A pulse that was already weak becomes almost imperceptible in the wrist, though it may still be found, faintly, in the carotid artery in the neck. The heart is working with diminishing efficiency, pumping less blood per beat, reaching fewer organs with each contraction. The skin tells the story of all of this. The mottling that appeared on the knees and feet days earlier has often spread by now. The hands have the color of ash or of pale bruised gray. The lips may be bluish. The extremities are cold to the touch in a way that is distinctly different from merely being cool, a kind of deep coolness that comes from blood having almost entirely withdrawn from those regions. The body temperature begins to drift. The brain's thermostat, like its respiratory control center, is losing its accuracy. There may be a mild fever. There may be sweating on the forehead, even as the feet are cold. The temperature regulation that the healthy hypothalamus managed so precisely, keeping the body within a narrow range of 37 degrees Celsius day after day, year after year, is simply no longer being managed. The person at this point is, in most cases, either completely unconscious or cycling through very brief and shallow surfaces into awareness that may not be recognizable as consciousness from the outside. There may be small movements. The fingers may twitch. The face may change expression briefly. There may be occasional moaning or a sound that families sometimes interpret as a cry, but that is, in the clinical assessment of experienced palliative care nurses, neurological activity rather than an expression of pain. The brain, even deeply unconscious, is still a place where electrical activity occurs, and some of that activity produces outward signs that can be misread by people who love the person and want desperately to help them. There is a phenomenon that occurs in the final 24 hours or so that catches many families entirely off guard, and that has, in some tragic cases, led them to believe that their loved one was recovering when they were not. It is called the terminal surge, or sometimes the pre-death rally, or end-of-life brightening. Whatever name you give it, the phenomenon is real and well documented, and it is precisely the opposite of what it looks like. Some people, in the last day of life, after days of unconsciousness or near unconsciousness, sit up. They open their eyes clearly. They speak, sometimes at length. They recognize people in the room. They may ask for food or express something that has been unsaid, or demonstrate a sudden quality of vitality that their family, watching, can only interpret as improvement, as if something has turned around. As if the body has found a reserve they did not know was there. In most cases, this rally lasts for hours at most, and sometimes only minutes, and then the person slips back into unconsciousness, and they do not surface again. The mechanisms behind the terminal surge are not fully understood. One hypothesis is that it involves a final neurochemical release, a last cascade of stimulating neurotransmitters from a system that has reached some critical threshold and responds by briefly firing everything it has left. The clinical experience of palliative care workers is clear. When the terminal surge happens, death is typically hours away. The brightness is real, the return is real, and it is the last one. Part 7. The Last Sense. What hearing tells us about the dying mind. There is a piece of research that was published in the journal Scientific Reports in 2020, conducted by a team at the University of British Columbia, that changed how many hospice nurses and palliative care physicians talk to families about the final hours. It was a small study, careful and rigorous, and what it found was something that the people who sit with the dying had believed for years, but had never had the science to confirm. The dying can still hear you. The study, led by researcher Elizabeth Blunden as part of her doctoral work in psychology, used electroencephalography, the same brain monitoring technology used in the research on dying brain activity more broadly, to measure the brain's responses to sound in hospice patients who were completely unresponsive in the final hours of their lives. The patients were at St. John Hospice in Vancouver. They had been carefully enrolled in the study earlier, when they were still conscious and capable of giving genuine informed consent. They had agreed, in advance, to have their brain activity measured if they became unresponsive near the end of life. The researchers played a series of tones to the unresponsive patients and compared the brain responses to those of healthy young adults listening to the same sounds. What they found was that even in patients who showed no outward signs of consciousness, whose eyes were closed, and who could not be woken by sound or touch, the brain was still registering the tones, still differentiating between them, still generating the specific electrical signatures that, in healthy conscious people, correspond to auditory processing, not identically to a healthy awake brain. The signals were quieter, slower, slightly attenuated, but they were present, and they were meaningfully present, not at the noise floor of the instrument, but as genuine, detectable brain responses to sound. The lead researcher summarized it simply. The data showed that a dying brain can respond to sound even in an unconscious state up to the last hours of life. The implication for families is profound and also consoling. The words you speak to someone in the final hours are not disappearing into silence. They are reaching a brain that is still, in some functional sense, receiving them. Whether that brain is processing them in the way a fully conscious brain would, whether meaning and emotion and recognition are part of what is happening in those final EEG traces, is uncertain. The researchers were scrupulous about not over-claiming. An EEG signal tells you that sound was detected. It does not tell you that comfort was felt, or that love was understood, or that the words arrived as language rather than as pure acoustic pattern. But it tells you that the auditory system is still doing its job. And in 30 years of palliative care medicine, the physician who helped inspire this research had watched dying patients produce small responses to the voices of the people who loved them. A slight change in facial expression, a slowing of the breath, a relaxation that came over the body when a familiar voice arrived in the room. The science confirmed what the clinicians had already suspected from long and careful observation. Hearing is understood, among palliative care specialists, to be the last sense to fade. The sequence in which the senses withdraw in the dying process has been described by clinicians who have devoted their careers to watching it. Taste and smell go first, and they go early, often weeks before death. The appetite disappears, partly because food no longer tastes like anything. Then vision dims, not suddenly, but progressively, the world growing dimmer and harder to focus on, the distance vision fading before the near vision, the colors flattening, then touch recedes. The ability to feel pressure and temperature in the extremities fades as circulation withdraws from those regions, and hearing stays longest. The auditory cortex is deep in the brain, close to the core structures that the body protects last, and it persists in function well past the point where everything else has gone quiet. This is not a trivial fact. It is one of the most practical and important pieces of information that anyone who has ever sat with a dying person needs to know. The room is not quiet in the way you might imagine. The voice of a spouse, a child, a sibling, a friend is still arriving, still being processed by the brain behind the still face and the closed eyes and the slowing breath. What you say in those hours reaches somewhere. Exactly where and how and what it means in the final neurology of a dying mind, science cannot yet fully say, but it reaches, and that matters enormously. The Hospice Foundation of America has updated its guidance to families on this basis. Act as if your loved one can hear you, it recommends, because the evidence strongly suggests that some part of the answer to that question is yes. Part 8. The final minutes. What happens inside the brain as it closes. The minutes before death are, from a neurological standpoint, among the most recent scientific frontiers to be explored. Until very recently, the assumption was that as the brain lost blood flow and oxygen, it would simply go dark, like a lamp dimming as the power supply fails, the complex and intricate activity of consciousness fading through gray and then into nothing. The evidence suggests this assumption was wrong, or at least incomplete. The story starts with rats. In 2013, a neuroscientist named Jimo Borjigian and her team at the University of Michigan were studying the dying process in animals. They induced cardiac arrest in the rats and measured brain electrical activity as it happened. What they found astonished them. In the 30 seconds following cardiac arrest, after the heart had stopped beating and blood flow to the brain had ceased, the brain did not simply fade. It produced a massive surge of high-frequency electrical activity, specifically in the frequency range known as gamma waves. Gamma waves are the fastest brain waves humans have identified, oscillating at between 30 and 100 cycles per second. They are associated with the highest levels of conscious processing, with focused attention, with the integration of information from different brain regions into coherent experience, with what neuroscientists sometimes call the binding of consciousness, the process by which the brain ties together all the separate streams of sensory and cognitive information it is processing into a single, unified experience of the world. When gamma waves appear in the brain, something is happening that is, in the language of neuroscience, associated with awareness. In Borjigin's rats, those gamma waves surged to levels that exceeded anything recorded during the animal's waking life, far beyond what they produced during normal alert consciousness. The brain was not fading. It was doing something extraordinary, something more intense than anything it had done while the animal was alive. And this was happening in a brain with no oxygen, no blood flow, no possibility of continuing its normal function for more than seconds. In 2022, doctors monitoring an 87-year-old man with an electroencephalogram for an unrelated condition were present when he unexpectedly had a cardiac arrest and died. The EEG captured what happened to his brain in the seconds before and after his heart stopped. Consistent with Borjigin's rats, his brain showed a surge in gamma wave activity in the brief window surrounding cardiac arrest. In 2023, Borjigin's team published a larger study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, examining 4 critically ill patients who were taken off life support. 2 of the 4 showed surges in gamma activity. The surges were intense, sometimes dramatically so. One of Borjigin's descriptions of the signal, in an interview, was characteristically understated for the drama of the finding. She said it was crazy high. What made the signal particularly interesting was not just its intensity, but its location. The activity was concentrated in the temporoparieto-occipital junction, a region that sits at the intersection of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes at the back of the brain. This area is known to be involved in some of the most complex and integrative aspects of conscious experience, in spatial awareness, in the sense of self in relation to the world, in what researchers call the out-of-body experience network. When this region fires, researchers say, there is a very good chance that the person is experiencing something, seeing or hearing or perceiving in some form. The 2 patients who showed gamma surges had prior histories of seizures, which may mean their brains were already primed toward this kind of high-frequency activity. The 2 who did not show surges had not survived to develop that same neural history. The finding is preliminary and limited by sample size, a recurring frustration in end-of-life neuroscience, where studying dying people is ethically complex and logistically difficult. But what the finding suggests is real enough that the broader scientific community has taken it seriously. What does a surge of gamma waves in the dying brain mean for the experience of the person? This is where the science reaches its honest edge. Gamma activity is correlated with conscious experience. It is not synonymous with it. Correlation in neuroscience is always a tricky relationship, and the fact that the brain is producing patterns associated with consciousness does not prove that consciousness is present, but it raises the possibility, and it does so in a way that maps, remarkably, onto the accounts that near-death experience survivors have given for decades. People who have been resuscitated after cardiac arrest and who report having had experiences during the time when their hearts were stopped and their brains were, by all clinical measures, inactive, describe experiences that share a consistent phenomenology, a sense of deep peace, visual experiences, often involving light, a life review, the sense of past memories, playing back with unusual clarity and emotional intensity, an out-of-body sensation, the experience of perceiving the room from a position outside the physical body. Sometimes, encounters with presences, deceased relatives, figures associated with comfort and welcome. Sam Parnia, a critical care physician at NYU Langone Health, who has spent a significant portion of his career studying these recalled experiences of cardiac arrest patients, has noted that the accounts are remarkable not just for their content, but for their consistency across cultures, across ages, across religious backgrounds. A Buddhist in Japan and a Christian in Alabama and an atheist in London describe experiences that share the same core elements. That cross-cultural consistency is, he argues, not what you would expect from purely random neurological noise. It is what you would expect if the brain were doing something specific and reproducible in its final moments. The Life Review in particular is striking from a neuroscientific standpoint. The sense that an entire lifetime of memories plays back in a compressed but vivid sequence is reported by survivors of cardiac arrest across centuries and cultures. From a neuroscience perspective, the hippocampus and associated memory systems of the brain are among the most energetically active regions when they are processing memory. If a dying brain is producing a massive surge of activity in regions associated with conscious experience and memory integration, a highly compressed and vivid review of autobiographical memory is exactly what that might feel like from the inside. Whether any of this is truly consciousness in the full and ordinary sense, whether there is genuine subjective experience happening inside a brain with no blood flow and no oxygen, whether the light and the peace and the life review are things that are actually being experienced or are simply patterns of neural activity that no one is home to perceive, that question sits at the very boundary of what science currently knows how to answer, and it may sit there for a long time yet. Part 9. The moment of death. Cellular, molecular, and biological. The moment of death, in formal, clinical, and legal terms, is defined as the cessation of heartbeat and breathing in the absence of resuscitation. The heart stops, the lungs stop, and those two facts, together, define the boundary. But what happens at the cellular level, in the seconds and minutes and hours surrounding that moment, is considerably more complex than any single line in a definition can capture. The heart stops last, in most natural deaths. This surprises many people because we tend to think of cardiac arrest as the event that causes death, rather than as the event that ends a longer process. What actually shuts down first, in the natural dying process, is the brain, followed by the lungs, and the heart continues working, in a diminished capacity, but continuing until it can no longer sustain even that. The cardiovascular system is, in a very practical sense, the last holdout. It is still trying to circulate what blood remains, still pumping with weakened and irregular contractions, still doing its job in the way that 2 billion years of evolution designed it to do, right up to the last beat. In those final minutes, the heart is beating in a rhythm called agonal rhythm, not the normal sinus rhythm of a healthy heart, coordinated and efficient. Agonal rhythm is the desperate electrical firing of a heart muscle that is running on the last reserves of oxygen trapped in the tissue, producing contractions that are weak, irregular, and increasingly far apart. The intervals between beats stretch, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute, and eventually the interval is not an interval anymore. It is simply silence. At the cellular level, death is not simultaneous across the body. Different cell types have very different levels of tolerance for oxygen deprivation. Neurons, the cells of the brain, are the most vulnerable. They begin to die within 4 to 6 minutes of losing their oxygen supply. This is why cardiac arrest, if it is not reversed within that window, almost always causes irreversible brain damage even if the heart can be restarted. The brain is the most oxygen-hungry organ in the body, consuming roughly 20% of all the oxygen the body uses, despite representing only about 2% of body weight. And it is the least tolerant of disruption to that supply. Skin cells and bone cells can survive without oxygen for hours or even days after death. Heart muscle cells have an intermediate tolerance. Liver and kidney cells fall somewhere between the brain and the skin. The body does not die all at once. It dies in layers, in a sequence determined by the oxygen requirements of each cell type and the order in which blood flow withdraws. This cellular staggering has profound practical implications. It is what makes organ donation possible. A heart that has stopped beating can still be removed within a certain window of time and transplanted into another body where it will beat again, because the heart muscle cells, while stressed, have not yet passed the point of irreversibility. Corneas can be recovered for hours after death. Some tissues remain viable for transplant for days. The body that has died is not uniformly finished. It is a landscape of cells, at different points in the same slow ending. One study that illuminated this in a genuinely striking way harvested neurons and supporting brain cells from donor brains up to 8 hours after death and managed to keep them alive in laboratory culture for up to 78 days. These cells were not simply surviving passively. Researchers were able to activate genes within them, boost their metabolic activity, and observe them engaging in functions that living neurons perform. They were not dead cells being artificially maintained. They were living cells that had outlasted the organism they had been part of. The brain died. The neurons survived it. There is also, in the very moment of death, a set of post-mortem changes that begin immediately, governed by the same physics and chemistry that govern everything else. Blood, no longer circulating, begins to respond to gravity. In the first 15 to 30 minutes after circulation stops, the skin of the face and upper body begins to pale, because blood is pooling in the lower regions, draining from the capillaries near the surface. This is called pallor mortis. It is the first visible sign. The skin takes on the quality that people describe as a quality of absence, as if whatever it was that made the person look alive has simply been removed. The body temperature begins dropping, losing roughly 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius per hour under typical room conditions until it reaches the ambient temperature of the environment. This cooling is called algor mortis. Within hours, as the cells die and lose their ability to regulate ion flows, calcium floods into muscle cells and binds the muscle proteins actin and myosin together in a locked contraction. The muscles stiffen. This is rigor mortis, beginning in the small muscles of the face and jaw and hands within 3 to 4 hours, spreading to the larger muscles of the trunk and legs over the following hours, reaching its peak stiffness at around 12 to 13 hours, and then, as decomposition processes begin to break down the muscle proteins, slowly releasing its grip again, somewhere around 36 to 48 hours after death. Part 10. What comes after? The body's transformation and the persistence of cells. There is a way to think about death that the biology genuinely supports, and that is, in its way, one of the more quietly remarkable ideas in the entire science of dying. The body does not stop being the place where things happen the moment the heart stops beating. It transitions into being the place where different things happen. The chemistry continues, driven now not by the body's own metabolic engines, but by the biological machinery of the organisms that have been living inside and on the body throughout an entire lifetime. The human gut contains somewhere between 38 and 100 trillion microbial cells. Bacteria, mostly, along with archaea and fungi, an entire ecosystem so vast and so metabolically active that some biologists have referred to it as a second organ. In life, this ecosystem is maintained in a dynamic equilibrium with the immune system. The body keeps the bacteria contained, the bacteria assist with digestion and immune regulation, and a complex and constantly negotiated border is maintained. At death, that border collapses. The immune system, which requires constant metabolic input to maintain its function, begins to fail within hours. The barrier cells of the intestinal lining begin to die, and the bacteria, no longer restrained, begin to spread. They move into the bloodstream through the gut wall. They reach the liver, the spleen, the surrounding organs. They carry their enzymatic machinery with them and begin the process that is technically called putrefaction, the bacterial decomposition of organic tissue. The process of autolysis precedes and accompanies this. Autolysis is a different kind of cellular breakdown, not driven by bacteria, but by the cell's own enzymes. Every living cell contains organelles, called lysosomes, membrane-bound sacs filled with digestive enzymes that the cell uses to break down and recycle damaged proteins and cellular debris. In living cells, these enzymes are safely contained within their membrane boundaries. When the cell dies and its membrane begins to degrade, those enzymes leak out. They begin digesting the cellular contents, and then the surrounding tissue. Autolysis is, in a very literal sense, the body beginning to digest itself. It starts within minutes to hours of cellular death, and is one of the earliest and most fundamental processes of decomposition. The combination of autolysis and bacterial putrefaction is what eventually reduces the complex and intricate structures of the human body to simpler compounds, releasing nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, and other elements back into the soil. This process, which can take anywhere from weeks to years depending on environmental conditions, is not the end of anything as much as it is a transformation. The molecules that made the body are not destroyed, they are redistributed. They become part of the soil microbiome, available to be taken up by plant roots, incorporated into plant tissue, eaten by insects and animals, moved through food webs and weather systems and geological processes. The carbon in your body was, before it was in your body, part of the atmosphere, absorbed by the plant that became the food that you ate. Before that, it was in another organism. Before that, in the rock or the ocean. The matter is ancient, and it is borrowing more than owning. At death, the body's borrowing period ends, and the lease comes due. The atoms return to the pool from which the next generation of living things will draw. There is a detail in all of this that deserves to be held for a moment before we move on. In the months following death, as cells decompose and tissues break down, the genes in those cells are not immediately silent. They continue to be expressed for a period, some of them more actively in death than in life. Researchers who have examined the gene expression patterns in human tissues in the hours and days after death have found that certain genes associated with fetal development, with the very earliest stages of cellular differentiation, are reactivated. Genes that have been silent since the first days after fertilization turn on again, briefly, as the cell responds to its changing internal environment. What this means is a genuinely open biological question. But it is one of those facts that tends to sit quietly in the mind once you encounter it. The genes of development, the ones that were active when the organism was just becoming itself, are the ones that speak again at the end. As if the cell, encountering the loss of the conditions that sustained it as a differentiated, specialized adult cell, falls back through its own developmental history, searching in its gene expression for something it no longer has the context to find. Part 11. The Open Questions. What science cannot yet say about dying. After everything we have traced through this long and careful journey, from the weeks before death to the minutes beyond it, there are questions that science has not yet answered, and that may, in their deepest form, require kinds of understanding that physics and biology, as currently practiced, are not fully equipped to provide. The question of consciousness in the dying brain is the most significant of these. The gamma-wave surges that Jimo Borjigin's team has documented are real. The correlation between gamma-wave activity and conscious experience is real. But correlation is not experience, and the gap between an EEG signal and a subjective moment of being is one of the deepest gaps in all of science, one that philosophers have named the hard problem of consciousness, and that remains, after decades of serious work by some of the most formidable minds in neuroscience and philosophy, as open as it ever was, when a dying person reports, after resuscitation, a vivid experience of peace and light and life, review and encounter with deceased relatives, and when the brain activity recorded during that period shows patterns associated with high-level conscious processing, there are two broadly reasonable responses. One is that these are neurologically generated experiences, real in the sense that the brain produced them, but not real in the sense of corresponding to any external or transcendent reality. The brain's final, elaborate fiction to ease its own dissolution. The other is that they are what they feel like, experiences of something real, produced in a brain that has, in those final moments, accessed something that ordinary waking consciousness does not have access to, whatever that something might be. Science, at present, has no way to decisively adjudicate between those two positions. The evidence is consistent with both, and that honesty matters, because it means that what dying people and their families experience in those final days and hours deserves to be taken seriously, rather than explained away in either direction. What is not in question is the quality of the experience for most people who move through a natural death. The terror that most people feel in anticipation of dying is not, by all the evidence accumulated in palliative care research and in the accounts of near-death experience survivors, an accurate preview of the dying itself. Pain decreases. Consciousness softens. The body deploys its internal chemistry in ways that ease the transition. The brain does things at the boundary of life that remain among the most extraordinary and least understood phenomena in all of neuroscience. Terminal lucidity reminds us that the mind and the brain, even when the brain is severely damaged, have a relationship that we do not fully understand. Deathbed visions remind us that the dying person is not simply fading into blankness, but appears to be moving through a genuine experience, whether that experience is neurological or something beyond what we have words for. The gamma surge reminds us that the brain at the moment of death is not extinguishing itself passively. It is doing something. Something active, something intense, something that, if we had the technology to read it clearly, might tell us things about consciousness and experience that would fundamentally reshape how we understand what it means to be alive. The hearing persisting into the last hours is, in some ways, the most immediately useful of all these findings. It changes what happens at the bedside. It changes what families say in those final hours, whether they speak or sit in silence, whether they assume the person is gone or understand that some part of the person is still there, still receiving the world through the one channel that remains open. The dying process is one of the oldest subjects human beings have ever tried to understand. It appears in the oldest written texts, in the earliest cave paintings, in every religious and philosophical and cultural tradition that has ever existed. And for most of that history, what happened inside the body during dying was a mystery available only to the person going through it, who could not, by definition, report back with any completeness. Now science is moving into that territory, with its instruments and its studies and its careful, scrupulous observation of what the brain and the body actually do. And what it is finding, piece by piece, is that the territory is not the bleak and terrifying landscape that fear imagined. It is something quieter, something stranger, something that the living, watching it from the outside, consistently describe with words like peace, or beauty, or grace. The body ends as it lived, in extraordinary complexity, using every tool it has, right up to the last moment. And then it returns what it borrowed, and the atoms go on. Part 12. Why we fear death more than we need to. There is a particular cruelty in the way the human mind handles the knowledge of its own mortality. We know, from quite early in life, that we are going to die. We carry that knowledge with us every day, in the background, and for most people, it produces a low-level anxiety that is there whenever we stop to notice it, a kind of existential hum beneath the daily business of being alive. But the science of dying, taken as a whole, suggests that the fear and the reality are dramatically mismatched. The anticipation of death is routinely described by people in psychological research as among the most frightening things they can imagine. The reported experience of dying, from those who have been brought back from the edge of it, is almost universally described as peaceful, not as an absence of experience, not as blank nothing, but as a state of profound calm that the survivors often describe as more peaceful than anything they had experienced in life. This mismatch between the fear of dying and the reported quality of dying itself has been noted by researchers who study near-death experiences, by palliative care physicians who have sat with hundreds of people through their final hours, and by psychologists who study what is sometimes called terror management theory, the idea that much of human behavior and culture is organized around the management of death anxiety. The fear is real. The fear is enormous. And the fear, based on all the evidence, is significantly larger than the experience it is about. Part of why this matters is practical. People make medical decisions, often very important and consequential medical decisions, based on their fear of dying rather than on accurate knowledge of what dying actually involves. The choice to pursue aggressive treatment that may extend life by weeks while significantly diminishing its quality is often made out of fear rather than preference, because the fear of dying imagines something worse than the treatment, and the treatment, in all its specificity, is at least a known territory. If the science of dying were better communicated, if what palliative care has learned over decades about the relative peacefulness of natural death were as widely known as the fear that most people carry, different choices might be made. Not better choices in any absolute sense, because what is right for any individual facing death is deeply personal and cannot be generalized, but more informed choices made from a more accurate picture of what lies ahead. There is also something here that goes beyond the medical. The fear of death shapes how we live. It drives urgency in ways that are sometimes useful and sometimes not. It makes certain conversations feel impossible, causes families to avoid talking about what they want at the end of life until the conversation is too urgent and too late to have well. It means that most people die having not said the things they needed to say to the people they needed to say them to, because saying those things felt, somehow, like inviting what was feared. The science does not resolve any of the philosophical or spiritual questions that death raises. It does not tell us whether consciousness persists beyond the brain, whether the dying person's experience of encountering deceased relatives corresponds to anything that exists outside their own neurology, whether there is anything on the other side of the last heartbeat, or only the silence that preceded the first one. These are questions that science, at present, cannot answer, and humility requires saying so clearly. But what the science can say, with genuine confidence, is that the dying process itself is far less terrible than it looks from the outside. The body has built into it, at a chemical and neurological level, a set of mechanisms that ease the transition in ways that the healthy living brain, which has no experience of dying and therefore imagines it poorly, almost never predicts. The pain decreases. The fear dissolves. The brain does something extraordinary and still not fully understood, and hearing remains as a thread of connection longer than anything else. Part 13. Listening to the dying, what they have tried to tell us. For as long as there have been people willing to sit at the bedside and listen, the dying have been trying to communicate what they are experiencing. And for almost as long, the living have been uncertain whether to believe them. Christopher Kerr is a palliative care physician in Buffalo, New York, who has spent years studying what he calls end-of-life dreams and visions, the experiences that dying people report in the days and weeks before death. He has sat with hundreds of patients, listened to their accounts, recorded what they described, and analyzed the patterns. What he has found has led him to a position that sits uncomfortably between neuroscience and something that neuroscience does not quite have the tools to address. The visions his patients describe are not random. They are not the chaotic scramble of a delirious brain producing noise. They are coherent, sequential, emotionally meaningful, and often, in the judgment of the patients themselves, more real and more vivid than ordinary dreaming. They frequently involve being visited by deceased people who matter deeply to the patient. They frequently involve a quality of reassurance and readiness, a sense that someone has come to help the person through what is coming. And they frequently have a profound effect on the person having them, reducing fear and distress, and producing a quality of acceptance that Kerr says is unlike anything produced by medication or psychological intervention. Whether these experiences are hallucinations, in the neurological sense of perceptions, without external stimulus, is a complicated question. They are correlated with altered brain chemistry and reduced oxygen. But they are also distinct from delirium in several ways that palliative care clinicians have been careful to document. Delirium tends to produce fear and distress. These visions tend to produce calm and comfort. Delirium produces confusion about identity and place and time. These visions tend to be remarkably coherent and emotionally precise. Delirium responds to antipsychotic medication. These visions do not always respond, and often the patients themselves do not want them to stop. In a 2016 nationwide survey of bereaved family members of cancer patients in Japan, researchers found that the majority of families who had witnessed their loved one experiencing deathbed visions ultimately described those experiences as positive. Not frightening, not disturbing, but meaningful, comforting. In some cases, a kind of completion. The figure of the deceased mother or spouse or sibling appearing at the bedside was read by both the patient and the family, not as a sign of confusion, but as a sign of something else, something the clinical language of medicine is not fully equipped to name. What dying people have consistently tried to tell us is that the experience of dying is not what the living imagine, that there is something in those final days and hours that is not simply the failure of the body, but something that feels, from the inside, like a preparation or a reception, or a transition into something that the words available in ordinary life are inadequate to describe. Exactly what that something is remains, honestly and precisely, beyond the current reach of science to confirm or to deny. But listening matters. The willingness to take seriously what dying people report, to treat their accounts as data worth examining rather than noise produced by a failing brain, has led to real scientific advances in understanding the neurology of dying, and it has led palliative care to a place where the experience of dying people is understood to be their experience, real and significant and deserving of attention, rather than a symptom to be managed or explained away. Part 14. The biology of farewell, a final accounting. Let us take stock of what science has found and be honest about what it has not yet found. The body, in the weeks before natural death, begins a deliberate and orderly withdrawal of resources. Appetite fails not from illness, but from biological priority. Sleep deepens because energy is being conserved. The social self turns inward because the cognitive cost of engagement exceeds what the body can afford. None of this is chaotic. It follows a sequence that clinicians have described in sufficient detail to recognize it clearly when it appears. In the days before death, circulation begins to retreat from the periphery. The skin mottles at the knees and feet. The hands grow cold. Breathing changes. Consciousness cycles between clarity and deep internal states that look like sleep but are something else. Something the brain is doing in those hours that it has never had the context to do before. Deathbed visions appear with a frequency and a quality that demands to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Reported by between 50 and 90% of dying people in various studies, consistently characterized by comfort rather than fear, consistently populated by faces that were loved rather than feared. Terminal lucidity appears in a fraction of these people and does something that the current structural model of the brain cannot fully explain, briefly restoring cognitive function that was structurally compromised beyond what should allow restoration, producing conversations and recognitions and final connections that the brain, by any mechanical accounting, should not have been capable of producing. The brain, in its final minutes, appears to produce a surge of activity rather than a fading. The gamma wave data is preliminary and limited, but it is real, and it points in a direction that deserves far more investigation than it has received. The last sense to fade is hearing. The auditory cortex holds on into the last hours of unresponsiveness, still processing sound, still sending signals that indicate detection, still maintaining, in whatever form remains of it, a connection to the world of voice and sound. The body, after death, continues to be the site of biological processes for hours and days. Some cells outlive the organism by weeks. The genes that were active at the very beginning of development turn on again briefly at the end. The boundary between alive and not alive is not a line. It is a gradient, a long, slow slope, across which the definitions of what constitutes life lose their usual clarity. And somewhere in all of this, in the gaps between what is known and what is not, there are questions that science is only beginning to properly formulate. What is the relationship between the gamma wave surge in the dying brain and the reported experiences of near-death experience survivors? What generates terminal lucidity in a brain that should be structurally incapable of it? What is the person, in those final hours of unresponsive rest, experiencing, if anything? Is the peace that clinicians observe at the bedside a product of biology or a product of something that biology has not yet found the language to describe? The honest answer to all of these is that we do not know. And the honest posture in the face of that not knowing is one that takes seriously both the biological and the experiential, the chemistry and the consciousness, the neuroscience and the accounts of the people who have been to the edge and returned with something to say about it. What is not in question is the quality of the evidence we have about the dying process from the outside. The body does this well. It has been doing this for as long as there have been bodies, and it has built into itself, at a chemical and electrical and structural level, a set of mechanisms that make the ending gentler than the fear of it. Pain diminishes. Consciousness softens. The brain produces something extraordinary. Hearing lingers, and the people at the bedside, if they know to keep talking, to keep saying the things that need to be said, are reaching a mind that is still, in some measure, there. The universe is, in the way that the best science has described it, made of processes rather than things. Nothing is simply static and permanent. Everything is in transition, moving from one configuration to another, energy exchanging forms, matter cycling through states. The body is part of this. It does not end. It transforms. The atoms that made it were present before it and will be present after it, in different forms, in different places, in different stories. And the experience of the person inside it, in those final weeks and days and hours and minutes, is not the emptiness that fear imagines. It is one of the most chemically rich, neurologically active, and experientially significant periods in the entire span of a human life. the body does not give up at the end. It does something remarkable, something that science is only beginning to fully appreciate, something that the dying have been trying to tell us about for as long as there have been people willing to sit and listen. That willingness to listen, to sit with what we do not know alongside what we do, is itself a kind of science. The slow and careful attendance to what is actually happening, rather than what fear tells us is happening. It is also, it seems worth saying, a kind of love. If this video brought you something to carry into the night, something to think about, something that shifted how you hold these questions, then you are the reason this channel exists. Hit the like button if this is the kind of content that helps your mind slow down. Subscribe so you're here for every new exploration, and drop a comment below. Tell me something. Tell me what you took from this one, or what question it opened in you that you want to sit with. Those conversations are the best part of doing this. Rest well tonight. The body knows what it is doing, right to the very end. All information in this video is based on published scientific research and clinical observation. Sources include studies published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, scientific reports, the Journal of Palliative Medicine, JAMA, and research from the University of British Columbia, the University of Michigan, NYU Langone Health, and other institutions. This video is intended for educational and reflective purposes and is not medical advice. Part 15. The physics of the final breath. What exactly happens in the lungs, the heart, and the brain when they stop? There is a temptation, when thinking about death, to think of it as an event, a point, something that occurs at a specific coordinate in time that can be named and fixed. In reality, at the biological level, death is a cascade, a sequence of failures that unfold in a particular order governed by which tissues are most dependent on oxygen, which systems are most metabolically expensive to run, and which organs the body has been prioritizing for as long as it can manage to prioritize anything. To understand what exactly happens in the final minutes and seconds of a natural death, it helps to start with oxygen. Oxygen is the fuel that powers the mitochondria, the tiny, energy-producing organelles inside every cell. The mitochondria use oxygen to strip electrons from glucose and fat molecules in a process that generates adenosine triphosphate, ATP, the universal energy currency of life. Every contraction of the heart muscle, every electrical signal fired by a neuron, every ion pump maintaining the voltage difference across a cell membrane, every protein synthesized, every molecule transported, every single thing that a cell does that requires energy draws from the ATP account. And ATP production, in the quantities required to run a complex organism like a human being, requires oxygen. When blood pressure drops to the point where meaningful circulation to the tissues ceases, the oxygen supply is cut, and the cells begin to exhaust their stored ATP within seconds to minutes, depending on how metabolically active they are. Neurons, which are among the most active cells in the body, exhausting their local oxygen supply almost immediately when blood flow stops. Heart muscle cells, which are doing physical work with every beat and therefore have high metabolic demands, have a slightly longer window. Skin cells, which are far less metabolically active and have some tolerance for reduced oxygen, can survive significantly longer. The brain, in these final seconds, does not simply fade uniformly. Different regions lose function at different times, in a sequence that is partly determined by the oxygen demands of those regions, and partly by the order in which the brain's own protective mechanisms redirect blood flow internally. The outermost layer of the brain, the neocortex, the most evolutionarily recent structure and the seat of the higher cognitive functions like abstract thought, planning, language, and conscious deliberation, is the most metabolically expensive and among the first to fail. The deeper, older structures, the brainstem regions that control breathing and heart rate and basic arousal, are more protected and hold on longer. This is why, in the final stages of natural dying, the higher cognitive functions go first. The capacity for deliberate reasoning, the ability to form new memories, the integration of sensory information into coherent conscious experience, these all begin to degrade and fade before the more fundamental systems, and this layered failure of the brain from its most complex and recent structures inward to its most ancient and basic ones means that the dying brain, in its final activity, is operating more and more from its oldest and deepest structures. from the parts that were there when we were not yet fully human, from the evolutionary architecture that preceded thought. What those deepest structures produce in the final electrical storms of the dying brain is something researchers are only beginning to map. But the gamma wave surges that have been documented in multiple studies appear to originate in regions of the brain associated with integrative conscious experience, regions that are connected to both the older emotional structures and the newer cortical areas. This is one reason those surges are so interesting. They occur at the boundary between the brain's oldest and newest territories, in a zone where memory and emotion and perception and self converge. The lungs, in the final minutes, are doing something mechanical rather than meaningful. The diaphragm, the great dome of muscle that powers breathing, contracts when it receives signals from the phrenic nerve, which carries instructions from the brainstem. As the brainstem's regulatory control of breathing degrades, those signals become irregular and then absent. The diaphragm stops contracting rhythmically. The chest wall, without the muscular support that normally holds it in its expanded position, collapses slightly, and the lungs, which are elastic tissue that naturally want to recoil inward, follow. The last breath out is, in a very physical sense, the lungs returning to their natural resting position now that nothing is pulling them open. Agonal breathing, the final gasping that sometimes occurs in the very last minutes, is not the lungs trying to breathe. It is the brainstem, still generating electrical signals even as it is deprived of oxygen, producing reflexive contractions of the muscles of the throat and jaw and chest. The gasps are not voluntary. They are not an expression of distress. They are the autonomic nervous system discharging its last electrical impulses through the muscles it normally controls, producing movement that looks like breathing but is functionally empty, not drawing meaningful air into the alveoli, not oxygenating the blood, just the final mechanical echo of a system that spent a lifetime running automatically and does not simply switch off cleanly. The heart, in these final minutes, is beating in its agonal rhythm, slow and irregular, each contraction weaker than the last. The sinoatrial node, the small cluster of specialized cells in the right atrium of the heart that normally generates the electrical impulse, triggering each heartbeat, continues to fire. But the signal is no longer being conducted properly through the heart's electrical system. The ventricles, the chambers that do the actual work of pumping blood to the body and lungs, are contracting in an uncoordinated, inefficient way. Ventricular fibrillation, the chaotic quivering of the heart muscle, rather than its coordinated contraction, is often the final rhythm. And from fibrillation, the heart moves to asystole, the flat line, no electrical activity at all. The brain's death and the heart's death are intertwined. The brain, losing blood flow, produces changes in the electrical environment that affect the heart's rhythm. The heart, producing inadequate circulation, accelerates the brain's oxygen deprivation. They are locked in a feedback loop of mutual failure that, in natural dying, moves in one direction without the possibility of reversal. At the moment the heart stops, blood pools by gravity into the lowest parts of the body. It is no longer a flowing system but a static one, and static blood responds to physics. The red blood cells, carrying hemoglobin that was designed to transport oxygen, settle out. The purple-red color of deoxygenated blood marks the dependent parts of the body. And above, the skin pales to a color that everyone who has seen it knows immediately and that they spend the rest of their lives carrying as a memory. The particular quality of that pallor, what it looks like when the circulation has stopped, how final it is. Part 16. The Dream Before the End. Sleep, Consciousness, and the Mystery of the Dying Brain's Inner World. The relationship between sleep and death is one of the oldest metaphors in human culture. In Greek mythology, Hypnos was the god of sleep, and Thanatos was the god of death, and they were twin brothers, sons of night, separated by the thinnest of boundaries. In dozens of languages, the words for sleep and for death are etymologically connected or metaphorically interchangeable. We say someone has passed away in their sleep. We speak of the long sleep. We ask for the eternal rest. The intuition that sleep and death are cousins is ancient and pervasive. What modern neuroscience has found is that this intuition is not merely metaphorical. The dying brain, in the final hours and days, spends increasing amounts of time in states that have measurable similarities to deep sleep and to dreaming, while also producing activity that is unlike anything seen in the healthy, sleeping brain. The boundary between sleep and dying consciousness is blurry in ways that are neurologically real. During the final hours of natural dying, the EEG patterns of the brain often resemble the slow-wave activity of deep, non-REM sleep, the quietest phase of the sleep cycle in healthy people, characterized by large, slow electrical oscillations across the cortex. This is the deepest phase of restorative sleep, the phase during which the brain clears metabolic waste products through the glymphatic system, the sleep-activated drainage network that flushes the spaces between neurons. In the dying brain, this kind of slow-wave activity may reflect the brain entering a state where its remaining energy is being directed toward the most fundamental maintenance rather than toward the higher-order processing of conscious waking life. But alongside the slow-wave patterns, the brain intermittently produces faster activity, bursts of higher frequency oscillations that look, in some studies, more like REM sleep, the dreaming phase. And this is where things become interesting. REM sleep is the phase associated with the most vivid and coherent dreaming. It is the phase in which the brain generates entire narrative experiences that feel, while they are happening, as real and as spatially coherent as waking reality. The brain during REM sleep is, in some respects, doing something very similar to what it does when awake, generating a continuous, coherent model of a world that the person is experiencing. Except that model is constructed entirely internally, without input from the senses. If the dying brain is intermittently producing REM-like states, then the experiences that people report in those final hours, the coherent narrative quality of the deathbed visions, the sense of moving through spaces and encountering people, the quality of being somewhere rather than simply floating in darkness, make neurological sense. The brain is doing what the REM brain does. It is generating an internal world. The question of whether anyone is inhabiting that world, whether there is a subject having the experience, runs straight into the hard problem of consciousness and goes no further by scientific reasoning alone. What the dying person's own account, given to whoever is present in the moments of lucidity, tends to describe as something richer and more specific than random imagery. People speak of being somewhere beautiful, of feeling that something good is happening, of seeing people they loved and lost, of a quality of welcome or invitation. The consistency of these accounts across cultures and centuries is striking. A medieval European's account of their dying visions and a contemporary Japanese person's account share more structural elements than they differ in. The figures encountered are almost always familiar and almost always deceased. The emotional quality is almost always one of comfort rather than fear. The sense of movement is almost always towards something rather than away from something. Whatever the brain is doing in those hours, it is not producing horror. It is producing consistently and remarkably, something that feels to the person in it like coming home. Part 17. The people who sit with the dying. What hospice workers have learned. There is a category of knowledge that cannot be captured in peer-reviewed studies because it is accumulated through direct, sustained, intimate observation over years and decades at the bedsides of hundreds of dying people. It is the knowledge of hospice nurses and palliative care physicians and death doulas and the families who have done this more than once. It is the knowledge of people who have learned to read the dying in a way that most living people never develop the opportunity or the willingness to learn. What they know is not mystical. It is practical and specific and grounded in exactly what they have seen. They know what the skin looks like at 12 hours, at 6 hours, at 1 hour. They know what breathing sounds like when it is measured in hours, and what it sounds like when it is measured in minutes. They know what the face does, the particular relaxation that comes over it, the specific quality of stillness that precedes the final stillness. They have learned to recognize the terminal surge not as recovery, but as farewell. They have learned to tell families that the person can still hear them. But they have also learned something that is harder to quantify, and that many of them speak about with a quality of careful wonder that comes from people who are not prone to sentimentality. Something about the dying process, in its final hours, produces a quality in the room that everyone present tends to notice. A stillness that is different from ordinary stillness. A quality of presence that many families and many hospice workers find difficult to describe but consistent to report. the sense that something is happening that is larger than the visible biology of it. Hospice nurses, in surveys and interviews, report in substantial numbers that they have witnessed things at the bedside that they do not fully know how to explain within the framework they were trained in. Not dramatic events, not levitations or visions shared across the room, but small things. A dying person who has not opened their eyes in days, opening them at the moment a specific person enters the room. A person whose final coherent words, delivered in the last minutes before unconsciousness, were exactly what the family needed to hear. The particular quality of the final breath, which experienced hospice workers describe as nothing like any other breath, as having a quality of completion rather than interruption. These are not data. They cannot be published. They are not amenable to the kind of analysis that produces p-values and confidence intervals. But they are what the people who have done this work consistently report across countries and cultures and decades. And there is a category of evidence that is not anecdote and not data, but that deserves to be noted with honesty. It is the testimony of careful, experienced observers who have no stake in making the dying process more mysterious than it is. What those observers have learned, collectively and slowly, through the most intimate kind of fieldwork, is that the dying process is almost never as bad as the living fear it will be, that people in their final hours are almost never in the distress that the healthy imagine they must be in, and that there is, at the end of most natural lives, a quality of something that the medical language calls a good death, and that families, when they experience it, describe simply as peaceful, not as nothing, not as a blank absence, as a quality of having arrived somewhere that was, for the person who arrived, all right. Part 18: Across Cultures, Across Time, the Universal Story of Dying. If the experience of dying were simply a product of individual brain chemistry and random neurological noise, you would expect the accounts of dying people from different cultures and different historical periods to diverge significantly. The specific imagery, the entities encountered, the emotional quality of the experience would all be expected to reflect the particular cultural context, the specific religious tradition, the individual's particular history and fears and hopes. What researchers have found instead is that the core features of the dying experience are remarkably consistent, not identical, not culturally invariant in their specific content. The figures encountered are almost always from the dying person's own cultural and religious tradition. The iconography differs between traditions, but the structural elements are strikingly similar. The presence of deceased loved ones, the quality of comfort and welcome, the sense of moving towards something rather than away from something, the reduction of fear, the increase of peace. A project undertaken by physician Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, one of the pioneering researchers in end-of-life care, involved thousands of interviews with dying patients over several decades in multiple countries. Her 1,969 book, On Death and Dying, described the stages of grief that have since become part of popular culture. But less discussed is what she consistently reported from the dying themselves, that what they experienced in the approach to death was almost never what the living expected, that the fear dissolved, that the pain, in most cases, was less than anticipated, that something happened in those final days and hours that changed the quality of the experience entirely, that made the dying, in her observation, often serene in ways the living could not understand. A century earlier, Francis Galton, the Victorian polymath, collected accounts of death experiences from physicians and nurses who had attended deathbeds throughout the 19th century. The accounts he gathered showed the same structural consistency, the calming, the reduced fear, the sense of readiness or welcome, the peacefulness that arrived in the final hours. In the accounts collected by researchers from traditional cultures, from indigenous communities in North America, from rural communities in Japan and India and across Africa, the same patterns appear. The deceased come back to escort the dying. The process is understood not as ending, but as transition. The community sits with the dying, speaks to them, understands that hearing is the last sense to go, because in many traditional cultures, this knowledge was held intuitively, long before it was confirmed by EEG. What this cross-cultural consistency tells us is not necessarily that dying is objectively a positive experience in any universal sense. People die in pain. People die frightened. particularly when death is sudden, violent, unexpected. The dying process in the context of trauma or sudden catastrophic injury is entirely different from the natural dying that has been our focus here. But in the context of the slow natural death, the dying that most people who reach old age will experience, there is a quality that the living consistently underestimate, and that the dying consistently report as better than what they feared. This is not a small thing. It is potentially one of the most useful pieces of knowledge that any human being can carry. The fear of dying is one of the great shapers of human behavior, human culture, human psychology. And that fear, in most cases, is a significant exaggeration of the reality it is about. Part 19. What the body remembers. Muscle memory, identity, and the question of who dies. There is a philosophical question embedded in the biology of dying that is worth sitting with before we close. Not resolving, because it does not resolve cleanly, but sitting with. The way you sit with a view that is worth looking at, even though you cannot take it with you. The question is this: what exactly is it that dies? The cells die at different times. Some cells are dead weeks before the final heartbeat. Some cells survive the final heartbeat by days or weeks. The bacteria that constitute the microbiome continue their own lives long after the human cells around them have ceased. Some individual neurons, harvested from donor brains and placed in culture, can be kept alive and metabolically active for months. The neural patterns that constitute memory, the specific connectivity between neurons that encodes an entire lifetime of experience, the architecture of association and recognition that makes one person different from all other people, begin to degrade with the first neurons that die of oxygen deprivation. They do not disappear all at once, they erode. The most recently formed memories, encoded in more recently potentiated synaptic connections, tend to degrade first. The oldest memories, most deeply encoded in the strongest and most redundant connections, tend to persist longest. This is why people with dementia often lose recent memories first, while retaining vivid memories from decades ago, and it is related to why, in terminal lucidity, the memories that return are sometimes extraordinarily old and precise. The question of what constitutes the self, the continuous sense of being a particular person, is one that neuroscience and philosophy have been wrestling with for as long as both disciplines have existed. The neuroscience suggests that the self is a process rather than a thing, not a fixed entity that inhabits the brain, but a continuously generated narrative, a story the brain tells about its own history and continuity. The self is, in some technical sense, a construction, built from moment to moment by the integrative activity of the brain's various systems. In dying, this construction process slows and then stops. The narrative becomes discontinuous. The self-model that the brain generates becomes simpler and less precise, and at some point, the integration that makes the construction possible simply ceases. The process ends. The story the brain was telling about itself stops being told. But what happens in that stopping, in the gap between the last moment of functional self-model and whatever comes after, that is where the science ends and everything else begins. The gamma wave surge, the life review, the encounter with the deceased, the experience that near-death experience survivors bring back and describe with a quality of certainty that does not resemble the uncertain, fragmentary quality of ordinary memory. These all sit in that gap, in the space between what neuroscience can measure and what consciousness, in its final form, appears to produce. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his career thinking about personal identity, about what it means for a person to persist through time and what constitutes the continuation of a self. He concluded, after decades of careful reasoning, that the boundaries of the self are less clear and less fixed than ordinary intuition suggests, and that what matters in the continuation of a person is not some fixed metaphysical entity, but the continuity of memory and psychology and character. By that account, death is not the end of a thing, but the ending of a pattern, the pattern that was a particular person, shaped by every experience that person ever had, encoded in the most complex structure in the known universe, and then, gradually or suddenly, released. The atoms go on, the pattern does not. Or, if the most hopeful readings of the near-death experience research are correct, perhaps something of the pattern persists in some form that current science does not have the tools to detect or describe. That question remains open. Genuinely, honestly, humbly open, not as a polite gesture toward religious feeling, but as an acknowledgement that the science of consciousness is in its infancy, and that what we do not know about the relationship between brain and experience is, at this moment in history, considerably larger than what we do. What is not open is the quality of the process. The biology of dying, in its natural form, is gentler than the fear of it. The body has built into it, at every level, from the neurochemical to the cellular to the mechanical, a set of mechanisms that make the ending more bearable than it should be, if all that was happening were the loss of function. Something in the architecture of the human organism has arranged itself so that the experience of dying is not, typically, the experience that the living dread. That is worth knowing. That is worth carrying. Part 20. A final thought. The science of letting go. Every cell in your body right now is doing something. Generating energy, maintaining the voltage across its membrane, communicating with neighboring cells through chemical signals and electrical pulses, building proteins and dismantling old ones, managing the flow of ions and molecules and information in a process so complex and so continuous that the word alive, which we use so casually, barely begins to capture what it actually describes. All of that will end, in you and in every human being who has ever existed or will ever exist. The machinery will wind down in the sequence that biology has determined, beginning with appetite and sleep and awareness, moving through circulation and breathing, arriving finally at the heart and then the last neurons. The sequence is not random and it is not cruel. It is the body doing what it has always done, prioritizing, conserving, directing its resources to where they matter most, for as long as it can. And in those final hours, chemistry will move through the bloodstream that makes the experience gentler than anyone who has not been there could reasonably predict. The brain will do something extraordinary in its last minutes, something that all the research to date suggests is more than the simple dimming of a light. The hearing will remain, last of all the senses, the thread connecting the interior to the voices of the people who love the person inside. The science of dying is ultimately a science of how extraordinary the human body is right up to the very end. Not despite the dying, but within it. The cells do not simply surrender. They give up their function in order, preserving what matters most for last, defending the brain and the senses as long as they can. The brain does not simply go dark. It produces a final activity that may constitute the richest experience available to the human mind. The auditory system does not simply fail. It persists, connected to the world of sound, open to the voice of a child or a spouse or a friend, carrying whatever is said in those final hours to whatever part of consciousness is still there to receive it. The story of dying is not the story most people carry in their imagination. It is quieter, stranger, more generous in its biology, and more mysterious at its edges than the fear of it allows. The fear is real, and it is understandable, because the anticipation of loss is always larger than what can be imagined from this side of it. But the reality of the process, taken seriously and traced carefully through the evidence, is something that deserves to be known, not because knowing makes it easy, but because knowing makes it less wrong. And sometimes, that is the most that knowledge can offer, and it is enough. The body knows what it is doing. It has been doing this for as long as there have been bodies. And somewhere in the deep architecture of the biology, in the endorphins that rise, and the consciousness that softens, and the hearing that stays, and the brain that fires one last extraordinary time, there is something that looks, if you are willing to look at it steadily, remarkably like grace. Thank you for spending this time here. If this video gave you something to think about, if it made the night a little quieter, or the question a little less frightening, leave a comment and tell me about it. And subscribe if you want more of this kind of slow, careful, science-grounded exploration of the things that matter most. New videos go up regularly, and the best part of making them is knowing you are out there, watching, thinking, asking your own questions in the dark. Rest well. Extended reflection. The relationship between fear and knowledge. Fear, in the biological sense, is a forward projection. It is the mind modeling a future event and generating an emotional response to that model. The fear of death is not about death itself, because no one alive has experienced death in the way that would allow the fear to be calibrated against the reality. The fear is about the mental model of death, constructed from whatever information the mind has assembled over a lifetime, from glimpsed hospital moments, from cultural stories, from the losses of people we loved, from the imagination of cessation, of self becoming nothing. And that mental model, in most cases, is wrong. Not wrong in the sense that death is not serious, that the loss is not real, that grief is not one of the most shattering experiences available to a human being. All of that is true and real and deserves every word it has ever been given. The loss of a person is the loss of a universe. It is enormous. But the fear of the process of dying, the anticipation of what the dying person is going through in those final hours, that is where the model and the reality diverge most sharply. The palliative care physician Atul Gawande wrote in his book Being Mortal that one of the most consistent findings in end-of-life medicine is that the fear of dying and the experience of dying do not match. That patients, when asked to describe what they feared most, consistently named things: pain, loss of dignity, being alone, that palliative care medicine is in many cases able to address. That the terror of the approach was often larger than the terror of what was approached. That the people who moved through it well were often the ones who had, in some sense, been told the truth about what was coming, in enough detail that the imagination could form a more accurate picture. Knowledge does not remove grief. Nothing removes grief. But knowledge can change the quality of the fear, can transform it from something large and formless and all-encompassing into something more specific and more manageable. When you know that appetite disappears not from suffering but from biology, you do not spend those final weeks forcing food on someone who cannot use it. When you know that the death rattle is not painful for the person producing it, you do not spend those final hours in a state of anguish that the biology does not warrant. When you know that hearing is the last sense to go, you talk to the person in the bed even when there is no response, because you know the voice is still arriving somewhere. This is not a small thing. It is, arguably, one of the most practical applications of the science of dying. The knowledge changes what people do in the room. It changes whether families leave or stay. It changes whether things are said that need to be said. It changes whether the final hours are spent in paralyzed silence or in the active, loving presence that the dying person's auditory cortex is, until very nearly the end, capable of receiving. Extended reflection. The cellular democracy of dying. One of the most striking conceptual shifts that happens when you study the biology of dying is the dissolution of the idea of the body as a single unified entity. The body, in life, presents itself as a coherent whole. You eat, and the digestion is distributed across many organs, but coordinated toward a single goal. You breathe, and the gas exchange happens in the lungs, but the oxygen goes everywhere at once, reaching hundreds of billions of cells, more or less simultaneously, maintaining the ATP production that runs the whole enterprise. The organism functions as a unit, and the sense of being a single entity, a single self, inhabiting a single body, is reinforced by the seamless coordination of it all. In dying, that coordination dissolves. The body reveals itself as what it actually is at the cellular level, a vast community of independent biological entities, each pursuing its own metabolic survival, that have been operating in extraordinary coordination for decades, and that, as the coordination fails, begin to act more and more independently. The neurons that outlive the organism by weeks in laboratory culture are not performing a trick. They are simply doing what cells do when the usual external constraints are removed. They survive, they metabolize, they carry out gene expression, they respond to their environment. The microbiome that constitutes its own ecosystem within the body continues doing what microbiomes do, long after the human cells around them have ceased. They are, in a real sense, unaffected by the death of the organism. They were living within it, but not entirely dependent on it for their own continuation, and they will continue for a significant period after it, breaking down the cellular structures around them with the same enzymatic efficiency they deployed in service of digestion during life. This cellular democracy of dying is one of the clearest illustrations of what life actually is at its most basic level. Not a property of organisms as such, not something that belongs to the whole body the way consciousness belongs to the brain, but a property of individual cells and communities of cells, each maintaining the chemical gradients and metabolic processes that constitute life at the molecular scale, each doing so as long as the conditions allow. Death, at this scale, is not a moment. It is a process of conditions changing until, cell by cell and region by region, the conditions no longer support the maintenance of the molecular order that constitutes life. The entropy that thermodynamics predicts will eventually win over all ordered systems, takes a different timeline in different cells. And the body, in dying, becomes a kind of gradient, a landscape of cells at different points in that thermodynamic timeline, some still fully alive and functioning, some degraded, some gone. The idea that death is a single moment, a line in time on one side of which a person is alive and on the other side of which they are not, is a legal and clinical convenience. The biology beneath it is a continuous process without a single, clean boundary. Extended reflection, sleep, the body, and the night. There is something fitting about exploring the science of dying in the quiet hours, when the ordinary demands of the day have loosened their grip and the mind is soft and the body is already practicing, in its small daily way, the surrender that dying asks of it in full. Sleep is the body's daily rehearsal of letting go. Every night, the consciousness that feels so continuous and so essential dims. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of deliberate reasoning and planning, and the tight executive control of attention, goes offline. The default mode network, the brain's resting system that manages self-reflection and memory consolidation, takes over. The body temperature drops. The heart rate slows. The breath deepens and slows. The immune system does its repair work. The glymphatic system flushes the metabolic waste products that consciousness generated during the day. And in REM sleep, the brain generates experience. Vivid, coherent, often emotionally intense experience that feels, while it is happening, as real as waking reality. Dreams are the brain's daily proof that it can generate a fully realized world from nothing but its own electrical activity, without any input from the external senses, without any correspondence to the physical environment of the room. The dreaming brain is, in a technical sense, already doing what the dying brain may be doing in its final minutes, generating experience from within, in the absence of the ordinary sensory grounding. Every time you fall asleep, you practice this. Every time you wake in the morning and find that the world you inhabited for the last several hours was entirely internal, you have a small piece of evidence about what the brain is capable of generating. And every time you wake from a dream that felt as real as anything in waking life, you have a small piece of evidence about the relationship between the brain's activity and the experience it produces, a relationship that is more complicated and more mysterious than the simple model of experience, as the direct registration of external reality. The body, lying still in the dark, breathing slowly, heart rate lowered, temperature dropped, is in a state that the ancient metaphors of sleeping and dying recognized as kindred. The physiology supports the metaphor. Not completely, not in all respects, but in enough respects, that sitting with both of them together in the quiet hours produces something that is not fear, and not quite comfort, but something in between, something closer to understanding. The dying body will do, at the end, what the sleeping body does every night. It will let the executive control go. It will let the deliberate, directed awareness soften. It will generate its own inner experience from its own inner resources. And then, when even that is no longer possible, when the ATP is gone and the ion gradients have collapsed and the cells can no longer maintain the conditions for any of it, it will be still, not empty. Still, there is a difference. The universe is not empty when it is quiet. The atoms are still moving. The fields are still present. The information is conserved in ways that thermodynamics guarantees, even as its organization dissolves. What a person was, the specific pattern of connections and chemistry that made that person who they were, is not simply annihilated, it is dispersed. The pattern breaks up into its component information, distributed back into the physical world, impossible to reconstruct but not destroyed. Whether that dispersal is the end of anything like experience is one of the questions that science cannot yet answer, and may not be able to answer with its current tools. The hard problem of consciousness is not about the neural correlates of conscious experience, the EEG patterns and the gamma waves and the blood oxygen level measurements. Those are progressively better understood. The hard problem is about why there is subjective experience at all, why there is something it is like to be a living brain, why the physical processes produce an inside view, a felt quality to the light and the pain and the love and the hunger. That question is as open as it ever was. And at the boundary of life, where the physical processes are changing and the inside view, if it persists at all, is changing with them, the hard problem becomes the hardest problem. What happens to the inside view when the physical processes that normally generate it are in the process of ceasing? Is there a moment at which the experience ends? Does it end gradually or all at once? Is there a last moment of experience? And if so, what is it like? These questions are asked in the dark, and they are answered in the dark. And the silence that follows them is not the silence of nothing. It is the silence of a universe that contains more than it has yet managed to explain. Rest well, tonight and always. The science and the story, why this matters now. We are living in a historical moment where the science of dying is advancing faster than the cultural conversation about dying can absorb it. The discoveries being made in palliative care units and neuroscience laboratories are reshaping what it means to sit with someone who is dying, what it means to be that person, what the transition from living to dead actually involves at the levels of cells and circuits and chemistry. And these discoveries are not reaching most people. The fear of death remains one of the most universal and under-examined fears in modern life. The conversations that need to happen between families and between people and their physicians about end-of-life care, about what kind of death a person wants, about what the process actually involves versus what the imagination supplies in the absence of better information. Those conversations are still, in most families, not happening until the crisis arrives and makes them unavoidable. The science is a gift, if it can be shared. Not because it removes the grief, which nothing removes. Not because it makes death itself any less final or any less real, but because it corrects the imagination. It replaces the horror film version of dying, the gasping and suffering and terrified consciousness being extinguished in agony, with something that is, in most natural deaths, far closer to what the ancient intuition suggested: a quieting, a deepening, a letting go that the body participates in actively, using its own chemistry, its own electrical activity, its own extraordinary capacity for generating experience right up to the very edge of what is possible. The researcher, who spent years wheeling EEG equipment into the rooms of dying patients at a Vancouver hospice and putting soft electrodes on the scalps of people who had already said goodbye to waking responsiveness, was doing something that matters. The neuroscientist in Michigan, who measured the brain activity of dying rats and found gamma waves so intense she described them as crazy high, and then spent years trying to find the same signal in dying humans, was doing something that matters. The palliative care physician, who listened to hundreds of dying patients, described their visions, and took those accounts seriously enough to collect and analyze them and publish them, was doing something that matters. The hospice nurse who tells families to keep talking, that the person in the bed can still hear them, is doing something that matters. Knowledge about dying is knowledge about living. The two are not as separate as the fear of death wants to make them. The same brain that will produce the gamma wave surge in its final minutes is producing every ordinary moment of awareness right now. The same chemistry that will ease the pain at the end is managing mood and motivation and resilience today. The same auditory cortex that will be the last sensory system to go is receiving the world right now in all its texture and voice and music. Understanding what happens in the end illuminates what is happening now. Not by making everything urgent or mournful or shadowed by finitude, but by adding depth and specificity and honest wonder to the fact of being here at all. Running on ATP and ion gradients and gamma waves, generating moment after moment of experience in the dark, sleeping and waking and attending to the things that matter, until, at some point that none of us knows in advance, the sequence begins. Quietly, with a reduction in appetite, with a need for more sleep, with a gradual turning inward, and then, at the end, with something that the science is only beginning to describe, and that the dying themselves have been reporting across every culture and every century, in language that is remarkably consistent, remarkably peaceful, and remarkably more at ease with what is coming than the living would ever imagine possible from a safe distance.